Hi there, this is Charlotte Reeves from Unleashed Education, and you've joined me for another Edit My Photo Winners Edit. So Ewan was the winner of a recent Edit My Photo challenge, and he has submitted this image of this gorgeous little Samoyed puppy in the Scottish Highlands, which is just an epic combination. I love it. The snow-covered mountain in the background is gorgeous. He's obviously used some lighting on the dog. I can see from the catch lights that there's some lighting there, so the exposure between the dog and the background have probably been better balanced than they would otherwise be, so that's a good starting point. So in this edit we're going to be working on bringing out a little bit more detail and life and colour in the background, dealing with the sky, making the dog look really beautiful and white, and just making this a really gorgeous environmental portrait. So let's get started. So first thing I'm going to do is check to see if these blown out areas of sky really are blown out, really don't have any detail in them. So let's just take the exposure all the way down, and you can see that there's an area here and an area here where there is zero detail, so no detail in those areas. So that tells us that whatever we do to that area, we're not going to be able to recover any detail in there. Also, if we take the highlights down around that area, we're going to end up with a really hard edge between an area that does have some detail and the area of no detail. So just something to keep in mind as we edit. Take that exposure back again. So let's have a look at some global edits here. I think we'll probably need to add a little bit of extra exposure. I'm going to take the highlights down. That will sort of help to bring back a bit of detail in this area here. We're not going to go too crazy with that though, because it's going to start giving us that hard edge there between the area of blown out highlights and area of recoverable highlights. So we're only going to bring that down to about here. I'm going to fill the shadows a little bit because I'd like to see a little bit more detail in this landscape here. And I'm going to take the whites up just a touch and then bring the blacks down to the point where there's no missing detail at the left of the histogram there. So probably to around there. I'll add a little bit of extra clarity and vibrance, and I'm also just going to add a little bit more contrast here in the tone curve by taking the lights up and the darks down. Now the white balance actually looks pretty good. I'm not going to really mess with that. We might revisit it at a later stage if we need to. So overall, that's a pretty good global edit to start with. Let's get started on some masks. First, what I'm going to do is the sky. So the sky selection looks pretty good. It has kind of, if we change the overlay mode to white on black, you'll see that it's sort of come down into the mountain and the top of the dog's head. We definitely don't want it on the dog. So let's subtract the subject. That sorts that out, and that also sorts the mountain out a little bit too. These other little bits I'm not too worried about as much. So go back to color overlay mode. I'm going to press O on the keyboard to turn that off so I can see the starting point. Now here I'm actually going to bring the highlights down a little bit more so I get a little bit more detail back in here. I'm going to take the dehaze slider up a little because that's going to add a bit of drama to the sky, which, I mean, it's the Scottish Highlands, so obviously we need more drama in the sky. And I'm also going to potentially just warm the sky up a little bit more and then add a little touch of tint to make it just a teeny bit pinkish. Okay, next mask. I'm going to darken off the bottom of the image, just darken off that rock. The lighting has been added quite nicely and it hasn't made this rock here really overexposed, but it's still quite a bit brighter than stuff going on in the background. So I'm just going to add a linear gradient. So M on the keyboard is a shortcut for that. I'm just going to bring this up about here. And I'm just going to take the contrast because there's quite a bit of detail in there. So I want to reduce detail and the exposure down there. So let's just turn that one off and on. Okay, looking good. Now let's do a little bit of work on this super cute little puppy here. So we're going to do a subject selection to start with. So select subject. Now, as you can see, it's kind of selected that little bit of mountain in behind the dog as well. So instead of using select subject, I'm actually going to delete that. And let's go for an object instead. So sometimes object works better than detecting a subject. So if we go objects, now it's in the brush mode, which is good. So let's just very roughly draw around the object and let Lightroom see if it's going to do a good job. And it has. And see how it hasn't actually selected the mountain in behind. It's recognized the dog as a separate object, which is great. All right, so I don't want to just make adjustments to the dog without also including what the dog is standing on, because otherwise it's going to give us a cardboard cutout kind of appearance. So I'm actually going to add with the brush and make sure auto mask is off. And I'm just going to select like the top part of the rock that the dog is standing on. Now, as you can see, I'm going over the edges here. I'm then going to go into erase with auto mask on and just fix these edges up. So it doesn't have to be perfect. I think that's looking pretty good. So this is the part that we're going to be adjusting. I'll turn the overlay off by pressing O on the keyboard. And with this, I'm just going to add a bit of whites, a teeny bit of exposure, not too much because otherwise we get that cardboard cutout look, which is not good. So just a little bit of a tweak. I'm just going to zoom in here so I can see it better. Beautifully sharp as it is, but I'm just going to add a little bit of extra texture to bring out the fur texture there. Tiny bit of clarity, and then just take the blacks to the left a little to increase contrast. Take the highlights down a little and then just the whites up a bit. Now I think if I zoom out again, if I turn that adjustment off and on, I think that's looking pretty good. I may have gone a little bit far, so you can actually adjust this really easily using the amount slider here rather than playing with these other sliders here and trying to get the right balance there. If you've gone a bit far and just want to back off a little bit, you can just take the amount down a little bit. So let's take it down to about there. Okay, so I think that's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty believable because we've also done the top of the rock as well. So what else can we do to the background? Now, naturally, there's a little bit of haze kind of creeping over the horizon here. You can kind of see how it is on the edge of the mountain and it's sort of spilling over onto the ground. I'm all about enhancing what's already there. So let's add a radial gradient. So Shift M, and I'm just going to pull this out along the horizon here. About this sort of area here, turn that off, zoom back out, and let's see if we can maybe take the highlights down a little bit, add a bit of haze, and then take that color temperature up, just to really enhance that kind of hazy feel of the, you know, the setting sun kind of creeping over the horizon there. I think that's quite nice. So let's turn that off and on. Yeah, see how it's spilling around onto the ground and also onto the side of the mountain. I think that's a nice little touch. Now, finally, I feel like we've got a lot of darkness in the bottom of the image and I feel like we need a little bit on the top as well to match. So let's add another linear gradient. So M on the keyboard, and I'm just going to pull this down from the top. It's not really going over the top of the dog, so I'm not too worried about that. I'll just turn that overlay off. And this time I'm going to just take the exposure down a little, just so it gives the impression of sort of dark storm clouds above, but a very bright, warm horizon from the sunset. I think that's a pretty cool effect. So I think this is looking pretty good so far. I think we're actually ready to take this into Photoshop. So I'm going to export this as a PSD file and I'll see you over there in Photoshop and we'll finish this off. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop where you can see Ewan's amazing file name, which is hilarious. And first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this leash. So I'm just using the polygonal lasso tool here so I can make a selection easily because the leash is pretty much straight lines. So if I were to draw along that with the lasso tool, it would be a little bit tedious, but that is the correct tool for the job. That's a pretty good selection. I'm just going to press delete on the keyboard and it will fill with content aware. All right, and deselect, and I think that's done a pretty good job. Now, I have noticed there is a little bit of a shadow here on the dog, and that shadow is from the leash because there was extra light added onto the front. It's created a shadow. So we also need to deal with that. So I'm just going to grab the clone stamp tool, and I'm just going to make sure that we don't have an obvious line there. All right, I think that's done the trick. It's just enough to sort of confuse the eye. So while I've been in there, I've noticed we've got a few little bits and pieces we need to tidy up. So I'm going to go in and do a complete tidy up on the image, getting rid of distractions, getting rid of blades of grass, things like that. So the tools that I'm going to be using there will be the patch tool, both used as the patch tool and used as a selection tool, so I can then do a content aware fill. The spot healing brush tool, the clone stamp tool, and basically anything else I need to do to get rid of all the little bits and pieces and make the image nice and clean. So I'll dive into that now. Okay, I think the image is definitely a little cleaner than it was. And I think to sort of enhance the light and shade areas a little bit more in this image, I'm going to do a bit of dodging and burning. So a good practice to get into when you're starting off doing dodging and burning is to duplicate the background layer. And that way, if you mess up, you can quite easily just reduce the opacity of that layer, delete that layer, turn it off and on to compare it to the original. I'm pretty confident with dodging and burning, so I don't usually tend to do this, but it is a good habit to get into. So do what I say, not what I do. So dodging is basically the process of lightening certain areas. So I always have the range set to midtones and the exposure on 10%, so very, very light. So what I'm going to do is just go in here and just run this over the dog a little bit, just to lighten up the dog just a bit more. It does a really nice job of this. So if I turn that layer off and on, you'll see that it actually makes a really nice effect there. And then I'm going to do a bit of burning, which is the opposite. So burning is darkening. So again, with the burn tool, I always have it set to midtones, about 10%. And I'm just going to burn off this corner and the bottom of the image just a little bit more, just to really kind of create a area of darkness at the bottom of this image to kind of lead us up into the subject. So let's just turn that off and on and see how it kind of reduces contrast a little bit in the process as well, which is nice too. So I think that's a good amount of dodging and burning. I'm going to flatten that down so it's all the one layer again. I have a custom keyboard shortcut set up for that. Now this image, I feel like it's not straight. I think the ground is sort of sloping up a little bit to the left, but I still think it's a bit crooked. So I'm going to do a content aware crop here in Photoshop. So when I crop it, I'm not throwing away corners of the image like I would if I was straightening when cropping in Lightroom. So C for the crop tool, it's the wrong way around. So you can just press X on the keyboard. And I want to make sure it's cropping to the same aspect ratio, which is 2:3, so that's correct. And I'm just going to kind of visually straighten it a little bit, sort of based on the dog's legs as well. Now, I don't mind cropping off that little hint of another mountain over on the right-hand side there. All right, I think that's a good crop. As you can see, there is some area to be filled in by content aware. So I need content aware ticked, and then I press return, and Photoshop is going to fill in those black edges for me. And from the looks of it, It's done a pretty good job. There's a tiny little bit of repeating pattern area just here, but that's very easy to deal with. Just there. So anything that repeats, keep an eye out for. This section looks good, and the sky also looks good too. So I think that's looking, it feels a little bit straighter anyway. So there's one last thing that we need to do here in Photoshop. If I zoom in, let's zoom into 100%. There is actually a little bit of noise in the background here and in the subject. It's not terrible, but it would really benefit from some noise reduction. So I'm going to use Topaz Denoise. So whenever I do this in Photoshop, I always do it on a duplicated background layer. So I just pull that background layer into the new layer icon in the layers palette there to create that. And then I'm going to go to Filter, Denoise. And here we go. So on the left is the original, on the right is the denoised version. So it's used low light as the model to apply the noise reduction, and you can especially see in these sorts of areas here, it's really pulled out a lot of the noise. There's also a bit of color noise here along the edges of the dog, and it's really helped with that as well. It's also sort of sharpened up the dog's features, so the eyes and the nose a bit as well. So I'm going to stick with that low light. I'm not going to fiddle around with any of these sliders here. I'm going to go apply. Now let's just turn that layer off and on again. It's a pretty subtle difference, but it does really make a difference to the quality of the image, especially if you're going to be printing it on a very high gloss kind of substrate. So something like an acrylic or a metallic, you do see noise really easily. This kind of thing helps to minimize that. So I don't really want to remove every little bit of noise from the background because I always think that looks a little bit fake. So instead, I'm going to use the fact that we've got it on a background copy layer here, and I'm just going to press V on the keyboard to activate the move tool, and then just press a number on the keyboard to reduce the opacity. So it's currently at 100% opacity. I'm going to take that down to maybe 7, so 70%. If I press 7 on the keyboard, and that has taken the opacity of that layer down, so it's just enough so that I can see a little bit of noise now, but it still has gotten rid of the worst of the noise and just smoothed everything out and added some sharpness as well. I think that's all we really need to do. So I'm going to flatten this down now and see you back in Lightroom where we might do a final crop. So here we are back in Lightroom. Looking at this image, I'm actually pretty happy with it. I don't think there's really anything much more that we can do in terms of painting with light to the image to make it look realistic. I think if we were to go heavier on, say, a vignette or make the sky even more dramatic, it would possibly just end up looking a little bit fake. And I'm very big on making images look realistic and believable. So I think that's about as far as I'm going to take it. Also, the crop. I was thinking I might actually take this edge in just a little bit more and then this edge just a touch more too. I think that's probably all I'm going to do. Done. All right, all finished. Hope you enjoyed that edit. It was a lovely image to play with, so thank you so much to Ewan for donating this image. I will put the before and after images in directly after this, and I'll catch you next time.